We're going to talk about the life of Muhammad at a very general level, not getting into a ton of details, but covering some of the biggest events in Muhammad's life and his significance for Islam. Then we're going to talk about the Quran, again at a pretty general level, talking about the major points there, about its structure and history. Okay, so Muhammad was born in 570 AD. So, of the Abrahamic religions, this is by far the latest to develop, that is, of Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. He, in 610, that is when he received his first revelation while praying in a cave. And that revelation reportedly came from the angel Gabriel, which, as we'll talk about when we talk about the Quran, there's going to be lots of overlap in Islam and Judaism and Christianity because Muhammad was so familiar with Judaism and Christianity. It was very common, along with Zoroastrianism, where he was raised and lived. And he also, by marriage, owned a caravan business, and so was acquainted with lots of different regions of the world. Right, so he had experience broadly of lots of different religions and practices and things like that. So him being spoken to by Gabriel is just one example of that. Gabriel obviously being a figure in the Hebrew Bible, in the Christian Bible. Okay, so that's when he started receiving his revelations, but he received lots of revelations. In 620, he had the experience of going to Jerusalem and being carried to heaven. And there is disagreement among Muslims about whether this literally happened or whether it physically happened or whether it was just a vision that he had. There are paintings of this. This is actually Muhammad's face is always obscured, but this is one of the few exceptions to the Islamic ban on images, is that they will paint this night flight to Jerusalem. In 622 is when he fled to Medina, which I've talked about in a separate video, as a result of persecution in Mecca. He was in Mecca, persecuted, had to flee to Medina. And like I said in that video, this is counted as the first year on the Muslim calendar, because when he fled to Medina, he was invited, and this constituted the first time that his ideas met with large-scale acceptance in Medina. But in 630, he came back and gained a military conquest in Mecca and set up shop there. But it was only 2 years later that he died. Okay, Muhammad could not read or write. So when he got his revelations, he was not recording them. But what did happen was his disciples memorized those revelations and recorded them. There's some disagreement on how the standardization process happened. That is, how we got a standard edition of the Quran. I'm sorry, I spell it in two different ways on these two slides. These are two different ways of spelling Quran. Obviously, it was not originally in English, so we have to translate that. There's disagreement on how we got a standard edition. The tradition is that his immediate successor standardized it. Lots of scholars question that now. But immediately after, or upon receiving his revelations, he was teaching his disciples. They were memorizing the revelations. And you can actually see some of that in the structure of the Quran. So one thing we notice with traditions that were at least primarily or initially oral traditions is that you see different things in the structure of the work. So if you go and read, for example, the Iliad or the Odyssey, you'll notice these weird things. Well, they're weird if you don't understand what's going on. They're weird to 21st century Western ears or eyes. One of the things that happens is that there's lots of repetition, right? So one of the things that happens in the Odyssey, for example, is that over and over and over, the author Homer will talk about, and dawn with her rose red fingers, da da da, and that's how lots of different sections will start with dawn with her rose red fingers reaching from the east, right? And it's talking about the sunrise. And there are little things like that their actual purpose is to help a bard or someone telling the story remember the parts of the story. So they're little road markers in the bard's or the storyteller's mind, because originally the Odyssey and the Iliad were purely oral for much longer than the Qur'an was, for hundreds of years, right? So what the people who memorized, there were literally people, we cannot comprehend this anymore because we're not an oral culture. We're a sort of written word culture. And maybe we're even transitioning away from that as more people are online and fewer people are reading the written word. However, in an oral culture, it was not uncommon at all for there to be people in any community who had memorized all of the Odyssey, which if you've looked at the Odyssey or the Iliad, people memorized that too, is kind of astounding. These are hugely long books, epic poems in the truest sense, right? So the way that people memorized them is they would make use of these mnemonic devices, or where sort of sections were marked, memorized in certain ways or with certain repetition. That's the important point here. You would see repetition, right? Something would be repeated over and over. And that was that's just something that sort of developed as people memorized this thing. And similarly with the Quran, there is some repetitiveness, or what we read as repetitiveness, but is really just part of something, at least initially being an oral tradition. So the disciples memorized and only later did they write it down. So it was briefly an oral tradition. And this is not uncommon. In fact, most religious texts are like this, right? If you take the Gospels, the 4 Gospels in Christianity, for example, those were written down accounts of something that had happened decades earlier, but they also show signs of being an oral tradition first. So people were telling the Gospel of Mark, the Gospel of Matthew, before it was written down. Okay, so the organization of the Quran is roughly organized like this, with the exception of the very first surah, which is a chapter. They are long to short. So if you read the Quran, you'll see the longest thing you read, again, with that one exception, will be the first thing, and then each thing after will get shorter until the end, which is the shortest thing, shortest surah or chapter. And generally, this is more of a generalization and less universal. It actually is organized long to short intentionally. Generally, the shorter stuff was written earlier and the longer stuff was written later. And so generally, with more exceptions here, the early stuff as you read, cover to cover, is older stuff. Sorry, newer stuff that Muhammad had revealed to him later in life. And as you get towards the back of the Quran, it's going to get towards the earlier stuff. And like I mentioned earlier, there is lots of overlap with the Hebrew and Christian Bibles. Muhammad was very familiar with those traditions, and he, in fact, agreed with a lot of what was going on in those traditions. He talks about Adam and Eve. He talks about Noah and Moses. He talks about Abraham, Isaac, Ishmael. He talks about Mary, the mother of Jesus, and Jesus. It's just that he disagrees on certain points, and Islam therefore disagrees on certain points. For example, he agrees that Jesus was a prophet. He disagrees that he was God or the Son of God in that way. Now, as a matter of artistic point, the Quran is often done in beautiful calligraphy. Part of the reason for this is, again, the ban on, or the prohibition on, image making. Of course, the artistic desire is kind of universal to humanity. So the way that gets funneled in the Quran and in the tradition of Islam is that artists funnel their efforts not towards image making, but towards beautiful writing, right? That's what calligraphy is. Okay, the last point about the Quran is that it's not the only authority of on matters of belief and practice for Muslims. So there are also hadiths. Those are the sayings of Muhammad, again, independent of the Quran. And there are also the Sunnah, which are the daily practices of Muhammad. And as we'll talk about when we talk about the divisions within Islam, the Sunni and Shiite division particularly, there's actually disagreement among Muslims about which of those hadiths and Sunnah are actually authoritative. But generally, Muslims accept the existence of some hadiths and Sunnah that are authoritative independently of the Quran. And that's where we'll stop.